Hey there, I'm Bill and welcome to Project Build, where today we're installing this double-din head unit and speakers in this old Jeep. So music is super important to me, and the Jeep currently doesn't have any way for me to hook my phone up to the stereo. I've been using this small Bluetooth speaker sitting here up on the dash, but it's barely audible at times, and Jeeps can get pretty loud while driving. I'd also really like to have Android Auto and CarPlay as an option, so I went ahead and bought a new head unit to replace this stock stereo. Before beginning any electrical work on a car, it's a good idea to disconnect the cable to the negative terminal on the battery to prevent any electrical shorts from occurring. Every vehicle is going to be different, but for this Jeep, to get to the stereo, I first removed the defrost vent trim panel by carefully prying under each of the friction clips it was attached with. And then I removed the 2 screws holding the top of the head unit trim panel in place and pulled it out, starting at the top, to remove it from the rest of the dash. I removed the 4 screws holding in the stereo, but I couldn't pull it out yet as there is an anti-theft bracket bolted to the back of this super nice, very enticing to steal radio. To get to the bracket, I opened and removed the glove box and then reached up behind the head unit through the glove box area to reach the nut that's bolted to the back of the radio, first loosening it with a wrench and then removing it by hand. I pulled the radio all the way out and removed the harness connections by holding in the release tab on the bottom of each with one hand and prying the harness off with a flathead screwdriver. While trying to remove the antenna cable, I accidentally pulled it a little too hard and unplugged it where it was connected behind the glove box. Whoops. I reattached this cable off camera. I removed the 2 screws holding in the thermostat controls and moved the control unit out of the way to provide access to cut the plastic tray here so there will be room for the new, larger head unit. And I tried a lot of different methods to cut this plastic tray, but in the end what worked for me was a plunge cut blade on an oscillating tool. I checked the fit of the new stereo brackets and continued trimming the sub dash as needed. I recommend placing something over the wires to protect them while cutting, and I did not think of this ahead of time, and I'm just really lucky that I did not slip and damage the wires. The anti-theft bracket is no longer usable and takes up valuable space behind the head unit, so I removed the 2 nuts holding it in place up at the top of the dash and maneuvered the bracket so I could pull it out. Now I'm done modifying the dash area, so I secured the thermostat controls back in place. I popped the air vents out of the old head unit trim panel and transferred them to the new panel, which has a larger opening to accommodate double-din size head units. Then I slotted in the new storage tray at the top of the trim panel and screwed it in place. Next I needed to connect the wiring harness for the new head unit to the adapter that plugs into the factory harness. I removed about a ½ inch of insulation from each end of one of the wires on the head unit harness using wire strippers, pulled the insulation off the pre-cut end of the corresponding wire on the adapter harness, twisted the wire strands together on each, and then twisted the 2 wires together. I slid on the base of a wiring harness connector over the wires, screwed on the top to lock them together, and gave the wires a good pull to make sure that they were secure. And it's the same process for the rest of the wires. I added the new mounting brackets to each side of the stereo, aligning the slots with the holes on the side of the head unit, and screwed it in place. The brackets have some adjustability front to back, and I did have to come back here and move the brackets forward a bit to get the head unit to fit in the trim the way I wanted it to. Mounted to the bottom of the windshield trim seems like a good location for the new microphone, so I stuck it in place using the included bracket and tape, and then ran the wire behind the plastic trim of the windshield frame by pulling the trim out slightly with a plastic pry tool and then feeding the wire behind it. And I fed the end of the wire down behind the dash to the stereo and used zip ties to attach the mic wire to an existing wire loom that runs on top of the dash and cut off the excess zip ties with scissors. I added 1 HDMI and 2 USB extension cables from the front of the head unit opening down to the glove box area, hooked up the radio antenna adapter, and then plugged in the wiring harness adapter and pushed all the wires back into the opening. I plugged the extension cables into the USB ports on the back of the head unit, but these can easily come apart, so I secured the connections by wrapping a Velcro strap around the base of one USB cable end, pulling the strap tight, and then securing the other end. This could also be done more permanently with zip ties. I plugged in the rest of the cables to the back of the head unit and pushed it and all of the wires into the dash. I screwed the head unit in place and finally removed the plastic covering the screen. Pretty. With all the wires plugged in, it was a good time to put the cable back on the negative terminal of the battery and make sure that everything is working as expected at this point before putting any of the trim back. Once everything checked out, I zip tied the USB cable that is used for media drives and firmware updates to some existing wires behind the glove box, as I'll very rarely need to get to this USB port. I also ran the HDMI extension cable and the USB cable used for Android Auto and CarPlay down below the dash, where I'll be able to plug things into them, and then added back the glove box. I installed the new head unit trim panel, pushing the friction clips into place. I wanted to note that off camera I put nylon washers behind the thermostat control unit to shim it out a little bit so it would fit this new trim panel better. And from here, it's just screwing the top of the trim panel back down, placing the defrost trim back in place on top of the dash, and we're done with the head unit install. And I wasn't originally intending to install new speakers yet, but it's pretty easy to do for this Jeep, and the stock ones just didn't sound very good with the new head unit. To replace the front dash speakers, I removed the 2 screws on the side of the speaker grill, pulled the grill off, unscrewed the old speaker pod from the dash, and unhooked the speaker wiring. I'm using new speaker pods made specifically for this Jeep, so I first figured out where I had clearance to drill through the front without going through the back of the pod and marked those areas. And then I put the speaker on the pod, marked the hole locations, center punched each location, and pre-drilled them. I pushed the speaker wiring adapter through a rubber grommet, starting with the larger terminal on the positive wire, and then inserted the grommet into the hole on the back of the pod. I cut some speaker gasket tape slightly longer than the circumference of the speaker and worked around the speaker to stick it in place, cutting it flush with the start of the gasket. I hooked the wires to the terminals on the speaker and then screwed the speaker to the pod, starting all of the screws first and then tightening them down in a diagonal pattern. I gently pulled the excess wire through the back of the pod and used hot glue to seal around the wires. I took the completed speaker pod, plugged it into the existing wiring, and screwed it in place. Then I added back the old speaker grill, and it's onto the rear speakers attached to the roll bar. I unscrewed the 4 screws holding on both the grill and the speaker, and then pried one side of the old speaker to start it free, pulled it off, and unhooked it. I added gasket tape just like before and plugged in the wiring adapter. There's no fill in the rear speaker enclosure, so I cut some fiber stuffing and inserted it into the opening. Adding fiber stuffing to the rear enclosure is optional, but should help to dampen the sound waves and make the speakers sound clearer. I hooked in the new speaker, aligned the grill on the front with the speaker mounting holes, and started all the screws before tightening them. And these grills are old plastic, so I was very careful not to over tighten this one, as the grill will break. And you can probably guess how I know that.
But how does it sound? Well, let's test it out. I've driven the Jeep around with the new sound system installed some, and the audio is much clearer and can be heard over the road noise much better than before. Something I'm really excited about is the HDMI port on this new head unit, and there are lots of possibilities to its use, such as watching interesting YouTube videos,
For big and heavy tools, 6 flip-up panels for smaller bench-mounted tools,
late night gaming sessions, touchdown, and as a carputer to do finances. So I'm not actually sure if it has practical use yet, but it's really cool to have the option to hook up whatever source I can think of to the head unit. And that's it for installing the new head unit and speakers. If you found the video helpful, be sure to give it a thumbs up, and if you're not already a subscriber, consider hitting the subscribe button below. If you want to install a head unit and speakers like this, all the tools and materials I used are linked down in the video description. So until next time, go build yourself.